Thanks for coming, everybody. This is Disability-Tapas, and today we're going to be talking about supporting students with psychological disabilities. My name is Danielle Johnson. I'm the lead access specialist over at the DRC, and I primarily work with our students that have psychological disabilities. My background's in rehab counseling. I'm a rehab counselor with a special emphasis in psychiatric rehabilitation. So to get started, and can everyone see the PowerPoint? Okay, I'm not blocking it, correct? Okay. To get started, this is a general breakdown of the student population that we serve at the DRC. So as you can see, half of the students that we work with have either ADHD or psychological disabilities. So psych disabilities make up about a quarter of the students that we work with. So really, really big chunk. We work with about 1,800 students. So quite a lot of students. And I would say that in terms of the rate of increase of student population that we're working with, psych is one of the population groups that seems to be just growing exponentially. Every year we're getting more and more students reporting, and that can be for a variety of reasons, from reducing stigma related to disability labels all the way to students recognizing that they actually qualify for services as students with psychological disabilities. So we'll talk a little bit about what some of those more common diagnoses look like. So one of the most common disabilities we see in the psych realm at the DRC is depression. And the difference between experiencing an episode of depression that's temporary versus a diagnostic label that's permanent is, if it's distracting, go ahead and shut it. Is that it's functionally limiting in a way that impacts your day-to-day life. So whereas a person might experience, short-term grief, but could still go to work and can still maintain day-to-day tasks, they might have, a temporary adjustment disorder or something like that. But a person with, say, major depressive disorder, their day-to-day living is going to be very functionally impaired by their symptoms. So some of those symptoms can look like sadness, emptiness, irritability, and there's going to be an obvious impact on day-to-day functioning with a lack of interest or pleasure in day-to-day activities. So cognitively, for a student in the classroom, that can affect things like concentration, it can increase levels of fatigue, it can affect thinking, so that thinking isn't as quick as it might be otherwise. And then in terms of the physical impact, which we don't always think about with psych disabilities, physically that may affect a student's sleep, that may affect their appetite, that may cause lethargy, they may be tearful, they may have a flat or sad affect. And that would be things like, low eye contact, poor posture. Sometimes we have professors or staff reach out to us and they'll say, a student was coming to me, crying all the time. They couldn't even talk about what was going on without crying. And that would be a good indicator that a person might be, dealing with depression in some capacity, is that if they're very emotionally just kind of fluctuating, and if their behaviors or reactions seem to not exactly match the situation, or if it seems that they're more sad or more affected by something than what would be expected or typical. And then another diagnosis that we frequently see is anxiety. And I would say the majority of students that come in with a more situational anxiety, it's related to testing. We get a lot of students who come to Cal Poly and actually develop testing anxiety while they're here, or it becomes more prominent while they're here just because of the high pressure environment. Testing anxiety would fall under a type of performance anxiety, which is actually a type of social anxiety. So it's related to that pressure of, if I don't pass this test, am I not going to get a job? If I don't get a job, am I going to be homeless? And so you can go from this very sort of like A to Z thinking where one concern leads you down a rabbit hole of, worst case scenarios that become debilitating for some people. And then other than situational anxiety like that, then we would typically see like generalized anxiety disorder, which is a more broad type of anxiety that may impact day-to-day life in very different ways. So anxiety disorders are characterized by excessive anxiety and or worry. And again, they interfere with daily functioning. So a person's anxiety is so substantial that it's impacting their day-to-day life and their behaviors and things that they do in day-to-day life. For students, cognitively, that's going to cause things like fatigability, poor concentration, again, irritability. So very similar to what we might see with depression in terms of the cognitive impact. And then physically, you might see things like restlessness. Physically, the fatigability may impact them there too, muscle tension, sleep disturbances. If a student has panic attacks, then panic disorder, panic attacks can impact them physically also and impact their cognitive functioning, can be very distracting, can be very exhausting to go through that experience. So that might be a scenario where you have a friend or a student that you're working with that experiences a panic attack, and just know that could be very exhausting for that person. They may not be able to cognitively be present after that happens because their whole nervous system and all of their neurotransmitters have just been activated and everything has been kind of, on high alert when that happens. And then another, and this is the third one we'll go over in the last one, another diagnosis that we see pretty frequently is bipolar disorder. And this is one that I think is less well understood by the population at large. There are two different types of bipolar disorder. One tends to be more depressive in nature with periodic episodes of hypomania, which is a lesser version of a full mania. And then there's another version that has more manic episodes with less episodes of severe depression. But either way, you're going to see those mood fluctuations with either type of bipolar disorder. Again, the diagnosis is going to interfere with day-to-day functioning. So just so you all have an idea of what mania might look like, because I think it can be characterized really poorly in the media and movies, and I think that there's a lot of negative connotation with the word. But mania just really means that a person is kind of elevated, so that can cause things like an inflated self-esteem, a decreased need for sleep, talkativeness, racing thoughts, distractibility, and risk-taking behaviors. So the ways that I most often see this with students is, I would say it's more often hypomanic in our student population here, and that ends up just looking like not sleeping a lot and getting a lot done. So it's not even anything that necessarily is that recognizably, prominent or obvious. When a student is experiencing, a full-blown manic episode, then that may lead to more of that risk-taking behavior, maybe making some poor choices and doing things that could harm, self or others potentially, or just those racing thoughts or kind of like grandiose thinking. But typically, if a student is on, medication or going to therapy and doing different treatment things, then those episodes are going to be fairly infrequent, and oftentimes with our students, they happen when the diagnosis first comes. So a student will experience their first manic episode, get diagnosed, and then once they start, doing treatment for the bipolar disorder, then it tends to, help to reduce some of those symptoms. And then depression and bipolar disorder is going to look very similar to depression and a depressive disorder. So again, depressed mood, diminished interest or pleasure in activities. There could be appetite changes, sleep disturbances, poor concentration, fatigue, and delayed thinking. So in terms of major life activities, this is the full-blown list of life activities that we kind of consider at the DRC. So in terms of the ADA and how we think about disability, disability is when you have a diagnosis that impacts you from some kind of major life activity in a moderate to severe way. So if a person is moderately to severely impaired in one of these areas, then likely they have some kind of disability. So you can see that the functional limitations are in a variety of areas, from self-care all the way to learning. And for a student, learning is not the only thing we're interested in. Academics is not the only thing we're interested in. Obviously, a student's, self-care and social interaction with people on campus and their access to the physical environment of campus are going to matter too. So we need to look at all of these different areas and not just think about the classroom, but also think about campus life and social life and these other aspects of the student's, identity while they're in school here. So take a minute and look at these and think about which ones you think might be impacted by a mental health diagnosis. Okay, are there any that obviously jump out at you as being this seems very obviously like a functional limitation that would be impacted by a mental health diagnosis. You just shout them out. You don't have to raise your hand. Sleeping? Interacting with others? Concentrating? Are there any that you feel would not be impacted by a mental health diagnosis? This is not a trick question. I'm just trying to survey the room, so no wrong answers here. Yep. Sitting? And why would sitting not be a functional limitation of a mental health disorder if you feel comfortable?
Based off like groups, they're the ones that we talked about, like how they represent and symptoms, like sitting and seeing something outside of that.
Perfect. Yeah, I'm just going to repeat what you said so that people online can hear too. So we talked about some symptoms of mental health diagnoses, and you said that sitting seems like, you know, a symptom of something that wouldn't be related to some of the other symptoms we talked about that are mental health in nature. Good, thank you. Any other thoughts? Okay, so in terms of psychological disabilities, you're on the right track, absolutely, with the sitting piece, because in terms of a direct impact, you know, no, psychological disabilities don't functionally eliminate the ability to talk or hear or see or move your body. Those, you know, that would be something like a broken bone or, you know, an amputation of a limb or something like that, or blindness, deafness. So there is no direct removal of some of those abilities. So the other ones that are listed are the ones that are directly impacted by mental health diagnoses. So those primarily fall in the realm of self-care, academics, and learning, with working and interacting with others also tagged on there. However, if we think about panic attacks, anxiety attacks, or even a severe depressive episode, a person could argue that every functional limitation on that list could crop up in a person, if only temporarily. So for instance, a person experiencing a panic attack might not be able to talk. They might not be able to hear what a person's saying. They may be so distracted by what's going on that they're not able to engage in those normal activities that they would typically be able to do. Same thing with things like, you know, sitting or walking. Panic attack may impact a person there, or, you know, depression might impact a person there. Depression can really impact a person's stamina. It can impact their energy levels and their capacity to do things. So that may look like laying in bed all day and not being able to get up because you're just not physically able to do that. And that is, you know, reasonable for that diagnosis. You know, manual tasks, that would be doing anything that involves like body movements, hands, and energy, pushing things or picking things up, and that could be really a non-functional activity for a person who's severely depressed or a person who's experiencing, you know, an anxiety or panic attack. So in reality, a person could probably argue that any of these could apply to mental health diagnosis in particular situations. So these are the typical ways that we accommodate students with psychological disabilities. The most common functional limitations we look at that are, you know, the direct result of the mental health diagnosis and not like a one-time thing or a temporary thing or a short-term thing are concentrating, learning, processing speed, memorizing, sleeping, energy, stamina, or pace, caring for self or managing stress, working, interacting with others, organization and planning, which is executive functioning, and then attendance. So those are the areas that we're trying to accommodate. And by accommodate, that means we're trying to provide both environmental and academic access to students. And that can be really complicated for a person who has periodic, bouts of depression where they can't get out of bed. That may look like not being able to attend class. And so what does that look like for a person, if they're periodically absent because of their diagnoses? So the accommodations we most often approve for those students would be testing support. And testing support can include extended test time, small group testing environment, makeup exams for students who aren't able to test on the day that it's scheduled, or testing breaks. So with things like makeup exams or testing breaks, let's say a student has a depressive episode or anxiety attack right around their time of testing, they may need to email their teacher and say that they've had a disability-related emergency and can't go in, to class to test that day. And then with breaks, same kind of idea. Let's say a student starts their exam and they say, hey, if I have a panic attack, I'll be good in 15 minutes and I can typically test even after I've had a panic attack. We may approve them for testing breaks, and then that way they're able to have their panic attack, step away, get some water, do some coping skills, do some like self-soothing grounding exercises, and they can actually return to their tests and do okay. But they need that extra time and that break in order to, practice those techniques and help to sort of calm themselves down. Some other accommodations we look at are note-taking support, postponed due dates, reading and writing support, reduced course load, and excused absences. So with note-taking support, that can be anything from low concentration in the classroom all the way to providing a peer note taker because of person's frequent absences. Obviously, if a student isn't attending class because of depression or anxiety, they're not getting access to learning because they're not in the classroom. So they're going to need a note taker to bridge that gap for them. Postponed due dates and excused absences are kind of related. So typically, if we see a student experiencing a more severe rise in symptoms, they may not be in class for a few days, and then that may impact, their ability to get assignments in by a particular due date. So they may need to navigate and negotiate alternative due date for some of their assignments. And those are, considered under a case-by-case basis. So there's no black and white, that we have with professors that says, well, for this assignment, it's always this many days and that many days. For every student and their symptoms and the type of assignment, we have to look at it as an individual situation that we investigate and explore and discuss and figure out, what's reasonable with the syllabus and the pace of the course and the student's symptoms. And we try to figure all of those things out to create what's reasonable for both the student and the instructor so that we're, meeting ADA, following the law, and supporting the student while also making sure that we're not making it so that it's become unfair to other students, or we're modifying the course in such a way that the student isn't really meeting course objectives the way that they need to in order to meet requirements for the class. And with reduced course load, that can happen pretty often with the students that I work with. Some of my students can only take, 8 units at a time. And it's because I always tell them, school comes second. When you have a severe mental health diagnosis, your self-care always has to come first. Because as soon as stress comes in, as soon as lack of sleep comes in, as soon as not eating comes in, you're not going to class, you're not doing your work anyway. And so you can only really be your best self as a student if you're your best self in terms of your self-care. So I really often will encourage my students to take fewer units. I always say, go low and slow. That's one of my little things. And, be proactive, not reactive, because I've seen too many instances where students have taken on too much. Like, let's say they've been hospitalized for a severe depressive episode and they take 16 units and then they end up, withdrawing from classes or failing classes because it's just too much. So you have to be really cautious about how much is realistic for a person to handle. And, there's no problem withdrawing partway through the quarter if things get to be too much, but it's just something to consider when you're dealing with mental health symptoms, is that really needs to be prioritized above all else in order to be a good student. And these are some different topics of consideration when it comes to students with mental health diagnoses. So one of the concerns with this population is that there is an elevated risk of substance use, substance disorders, and suicide. So those are obviously things that we provide resources for on campus, and we try to be aware of and talk to students. And we, for things like substance use disorders, we accommodate for that. So, by law, if a person is diagnosed with a substance use disorder and they're in recovery, they qualify for services with us that we can accommodate. And if a student is experiencing suicidal ideation, then we will walk with them over to the health center and try to provide resources to them and talk to them about what's going on. We will call, slow hotline with students in the office if we need to. So we try to do everything we can to support students that are, experiencing that. But just for all of you to be aware that can happen. Yeah.
I actually have a question about the previous slide.
Oh.
When you are creating those accommodations for students, what does that typically look like? I mean, is there often like a meeting with somebody from the DRC and the student and the professor, or or is it more individualized?
It depends, yeah. So let me actually see. I'm going to skip over to this slide really quick just because it's relevant. So our role at the DRC, so first we're reviewing the documentation, and so we need a DSM-5 diagnosis. We need to know what the functional limitations are, and then we perform the intake interview. So that's learning what the student's symptoms, having that one-on-one conversation, talking to them about accommodation history, if they've used services before, what they anticipate their service needs might be, and then sort of comparing that to medical documentation and deciding what's reasonable. And I always have very honest conversations with students and say, hey, if you're approved for excused absences, you're going to have to let your professor know in advance that you're going to be absent. Are you going to feel comfortable reaching out and doing that? Because there is a bit of student responsibility that comes into play. And if they don't feel like they're capable of doing that, then I really discourage them from using that as an accommodation. And then if they say, hey, yeah, I feel like I can do that, I'll either reach out to you or my teacher to let you know I'll be absent, then we would approve it. And excessive absences. Uh-oh, what just happened? Sorry, this may not happen on the computer. If there's excessive absences, then that's kind of when we get more of the phone calls of, hey, a student hasn't been coming into class for the last 3 weeks. At what point do I need to stop accommodating them? And so for us, it's always looking at how can the student meet course objectives. Under, ADA law and university policy that we follow for students with disabilities, the expectation is that students have to be able to meet course objectives either with or without accommodations. So if they're using accommodations and still not meeting course objectives, then we're not obligated to do more than that. There is that piece about student responsibility. So does that answer your question thoroughly? Okay. Yes.
Just one other question. So one of the recommendations you had up there was reducing course load.
Yeah.
Right? As I see that kind of what that looks like in practice, that means that students will be here longer, not only quarterly, right, but there are other kind of expenses.
Yeah.
As far as like providing any kind of support for those added expenses and those kind of things, is that something that you kind of take in consideration as far as when you're advising them to take
Absolutely.
reduced course load?
Yeah.
Okay.
So the tricky thing with reduced course load is that students are considered full-time students for all university programs and activities except for financial aid, because financial aid is dictated by federal law, state law. So we can't have any say over what kind of aid they're receiving. So if a student is receiving financial aid and they reduce their course load, then they may not be eligible for the same level of aid. So we always have that conversation because they may need to take that into consideration. Many of my students who use reduced course load aren't receiving any kind of financial aid and have support systems that are able to, help. But the other place that we always refer students to is the Department of Rehabilitation. So Department of Rehabilitation is vocational counseling for people with disabilities, but they can start helping you actually when you're in high school. And for students that are going to Cal Poly, that may mean that they can actually provide tuition funding for students, computers, ergonomic furniture, things like that. So basically you go in there and you say, here's my vocational goal. I want to be, a lab chemist. they will have you on their caseload until you achieve your goal of becoming a lab chemist. So that's putting you through school, that's putting you through grad school, that's helping you with interviews, that's giving you $500 for wardrobe for your new job, and then they'll close your case once you've achieved your vocational goal. So we really, really encourage students to get connected with them, especially if there's that financial piece that's going to be a challenge. Yeah. So really quickly, some other considerations to take into account are that there are going to be increased barriers to social and personal functioning. So a person with some of these diagnoses might be more isolated at various times, and they may not be taking part in like grooming and just basic things like that. So there may be some challenges. Yes?
As a WOW leader, how can we help accommodate and make changes to our schedule to help like the experience of this affected student, as well as like not isolate or like not make the whole week about accommodating them and still serving them?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. So I think that having conversations with the group is obviously really important, but also creating an environment and a culture of normalcy surrounding self-care. So if you can sort of inject alone time or time away or give options to people so they're not having to do all of that group activity all the time, and just checking in with them a lot. I know a lot of our students have a really hard time with WOW just because of the pace of it and the amount of social interaction. Even just people that are introverted can have a really hard time with that level of intensity. I know, I went to school here and 15, years ago was in WOW, and it was a lot for me. I'm really introverted, and it was a lot of like walking and activity, and it was just full on, for days. So I think, recognizing that fun may look different for different people and not expecting everyone to jive with a set idea about plans. So if you have your group sit down and talk about maybe what they want to do, don't just let a few people in the group dictate for everyone what's going to happen. I'd be really considerate about different, energy levels. And if people say that they need to take a break, I would honor that, figure out ways to make it work for them. And if you're concerned about them being isolated, just, reach out, give them a call, give them a text, and just say, hey, like, is there anything I can do? Or maybe giving them opportunities to have one-on-one time with you or your co-leader. I know I got really close with my WOW leaders, and that they recognized that I was like, I'm not into the whole social thing, and I really appreciated that from them. So maybe giving some more of your time too, so that it's not taking away from others' experience, but then you're still kind of honoring them as a person and in their experience too. So, any other questions before?
We're gonna do a WOW leader training, aren't we?
Are we? I think we are. I think we're doing a WOW leader training apparently. So I know that we usually have people come in and give some kind of talk to the WOW leaders. So, so back to considerations, and then some other things to think about are that mental health diagnoses can actually, well, obviously they can be hidden because they're invisible, but they can actually become secondary to other diagnoses. So you might have a student with like Crohn's disease or lupus or diabetes, and they might have depression on top of that, or coming secondary to that. They may have an autoimmune condition that impacts their mood, and that may look like some really good days and some really bad days. A person with diabetes and fluctuating blood sugar might end up kind of looking like mood swings. So there's complexity to it. It might not just be, what meets the eye. Students are typically not unmotivated or disengaged. I think that's really hard for people to understand if they've never experienced any kind of challenge to their mental health, I'll just say, or known somebody personally who has. It can look like not participating in life. And for most people, their desire is to not participate in life. They want to participate in life, and they're not deciding, I don't want to participate in life. They're really sort of at the mercy of what their brain chemicals are doing or what their body is doing. And so it's important to recognize that a person who seems checked out probably isn't choosing to be checked out. You know, there's more going on to it than that. So just be really sensitive to that. Symptoms can be unpredictable and varying. You may look great on Tuesday and horrible feeling on Wednesday, and that's okay. You can't expect a person to be 100% every day because, you know, the slightest changes, sometimes weather can affect people. Sometimes a conversation with a loved one can affect people. You know, hormones can affect people. It just really depends. There can be very quick fluctuations. Doesn't mean that a person's lying if they were really bad on Tuesday and suddenly they're great on Wednesday. It doesn't mean that Tuesday wasn't a bad day. It just means that there's, you know, variations to their symptoms. And then also just to keep in mind that there are very profound, you know, internal, external stigmas in our culture. So external can be things like disapproval, shaming, discrimination. And so students are always kind of thinking about and aware of the fact that externally people may not believe them. And I think that's one of the hardest things about invisible disabilities. And then internally, that creates things like fear, isolation, low self-esteem, feeling burdensome, internalizing external messages. I can't tell you the number of students that I've worked with that are afraid to disclose to professors or embarrassed because they feel like they're a burden or they feel like they're too much or they're going to complicate things. And they end up just not communicating because they feel like, you know, if they do communicate, they're going to, you know, cause a professor to be mad at them or something. But that's why we exist at the DRC, to help intervene if we can, and to sort of minimize the impact of that, you know, honoring that a person may feel ashamed, but, you know, trying to shift that narrative for them that you don't need to be ashamed about your symptoms. We just got to figure out ways that you can, you know, live with this and move forward. Yeah.
I have a question about the international stigmas.
Yeah.
When it comes to professors, is there anything that the DRC can or does when it comes to professors that maybe do some of the external stigmas when it comes to like shaming or disapproval, things like that?
That one's so hard.
Yeah.
It is. And I wish that there was like a really easy answer to be like, yes, we can make everybody believers, you know. It's like, we do tapas, we try to educate, we try to email professors. The reality is that some people are just not going to be interested in understanding or learning the information. That's not just professors, that's anybody. You can try and educate them. Some people don't want to be educated. And so our role in those situations where a person's not willing to learn, you know, we'll intervene through email and phone calls, and, you know, meetings, whatever. If they're not willing to hear what we're saying, then we'll try to intervene to the student as minimizing as much contact as possible with that professor so that they're not feeling responsible for navigating those conversations. Because that's going to be true for a person throughout their whole life. They're going to interact, you know, with people that may not believe them. And I would never want one of my students to feel like they can't move forward in their education because somebody doesn't believe them. That's not fair, you know. If a situation is really horrible, we could, you know, help a student withdraw from a class. Because likely what would happen is, let's say a professor is not believing a student, they're creating challenges with accommodating the student. We're still accommodating them, but they're, you know, kind of giving some pushback. A student's probably not going to perform that well in that class anyway, and so at a certain point we probably would withdraw them just because they're not academically going to be able to cope with all of that and succeed, you know.
But that would definitely be something that you would suggest to like voice, is if a professor's accepting the accommodations, but definitely putting out like some
Yeah. I mean, it happens, you know. Whether you're a person with disability or a person of color or a woman or an undocumented student, I mean, it's like, you know, stigma is going to happen. We try to do everything we can to educate people about bias and disability. We're trying to get allied training going, but the reality is that culture doesn't change overnight. I wish that it did. I wish that we, you know, snap our fingers. But the tricky thing with, you know, invisible disabilities is that we can't see them. We're going off of belief about a person and what they're telling. But it's kind of like, why would a person lie about that experience?
Yeah.
And some people just don't understand that. It's like, why would you lie about being disabled? You know, if you're functionally limited in your day-to-day life, why would you want that? You know, why would you lie about that? It doesn't really make sense. So But for some people, I don't know. They just don't want to, they won't hear it. I don't know. So that kind of actually leads into a good little segue to further considerations. So disability can't simply be overcome by trying harder, you know. Students aren't causing their own disabilities. Functional limitations do limit a person's educational access. You know, a person doesn't want to be limited in terms of their access. That's what happens, the byproduct of a functional limitation from a disability. If you encourage a student to be resilient rather than use services, that may actually create more functional limitations. If you just say, hey, pull yourself up by your bootstraps and just try harder, instead of saying, hey, go use the DRC and get accommodated. That's not going to work for a person who's functionally limited in their day-to-day life. You can't just try harder to come out of your severe symptoms. The experts on disability are always the students themselves, and disability is not inherently a bad thing. So, you know, for a lot of people, it's an identity marker. I'm a disabled woman. I'm really proud of that fact. I talk about that fact all the time because I'm not ashamed of that. That's, you know, part of my identity as a human being, and it places me in a culture of people that I feel at home in. So for some people, it's a really, you know, proud element of who they are. And the other piece is that, you know, people with disabilities aren't any less human than anyone else, you know. But unfortunately, with our history, our historical treatment of disability, we've treated people with disabilities as subhuman or as, you know, inferior. And so I think there has been a much more sort of real fight to prove value or prove worth, or even just prove the severity of your own symptoms, especially when you're dealing with something invisible. You almost have to prove to people there's something wrong with you. And that shouldn't be the case, but unfortunately it is. And then lastly, you know, physical and observable disabilities are not more real or worth accommodating than those that are invisible. Whether it's invisible or visible, they're both functionally limiting. They're both in need of accommodations in order for a person to fully access day-to-day life. We already went through these, but the bottom part I didn't hit on. So DRC students are not obligated to disclose their disability-related information to faculty or staff. Once you register with us, then we are the gatekeepers of that information. You don't have to provide doctor's notes. If you have excused absences as an accommodation, that's all the professors need to know. And we would only disclose information maybe about like functional limitations and some of the accommodation needs. We don't disclose diagnostic information unless there's a very significant need to know reason, like a retroactive withdrawal or, you know, something very serious. Instructors are not expected to determine reasonable accommodations. That's the job of the DRC. So professors don't need to be experts on disability. They just need to sort of abide by what we've determined to be reasonable for a student. And classroom policies that are equal may not be equitable. So what's good for one student may not be good for the next student. And so learning how to treat each student individually while still, you know, moving the course forward so that everyone's meeting objectives in a way that works for them. So there's some different resources on campus for any of you that need reference to different counseling services, both here at Cal Poly and then in the local area, low fee, sliding scale, and then different mental health support in the area. I do have to leave a few minutes early, so we can spend a few minutes on questions if anybody has more questions on anything. All right, well, if you're all good, then we'll let out a little bit early. Thank you all for coming. Please take some candy on your way out if you would like, and make sure you sign in if you haven't already. Enjoy the rest of your Thursday. Good luck to you taking finals in a couple of weeks.